It's wonderful to have you here, whether you are in this fantastic Frankopan hall, do come on in, or you're joining us online from wherever in the world you happen to be. It's great to have you here with us. My name is Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus. And Jesus College, as many of you will know, has a fantastic history. Dating back to the foundation of the nunnery in 1144, we became a college in 1496. We've had some really phenomenal people who have lived and studied here at Jesus College. But despite being a college since 1496, it wasn't until 1976 that we had our first female fellow, who was another phenomenal person, Lisa Jardine. She was our first female fellow here, but much more notable for all the things that she did. She was a scholar with one of the most impressive intellectual ranges, from English literature and cultural history to the history of science. So she published books on Hooke, Shakespeare, Bacon, Erasmus, the scientific revolution, and much, much more. She was also involved with policy making at a very high level, involved with the Royal Institution and the Royal Society. And for 6 years, she was chair of the Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority, and so much more. I had the pleasure of knowing her very slightly when I was a child. I know many of you here knew her much, much better. And will also remember, for example, the lapel pins that she would give people, women to wear behind the lapel that just said, "Behave badly." Advice I know some of my colleagues have followed ever since. Sadly, she died in 2015. The Intellectual Forum was set up a year later, and right from the start, one of the things that we've done is to do an annual lecture in her honour. And we've had a series of really spectacular lectures over the years. So last year, we had Alan Rusbridger, who was, many of you will know, editor of The Guardian, but also knew her very well from when he was here at the Cambridge News, Cambridge Evening News as it was then, working with her or reporting on her campaign to save the kite. So Lisa was a phenomenal person. But tonight's lecture, while it's to some extent about her, in fact it's very much a family affair, is actually really about her father, Jacob Bronowski. Well, I say it's a family event because on the one hand it's about Lisa's father, on the other hand Simon's partner Rachel is Lisa's daughter. So it's a sort of multi-generational action. It's wonderful to have so much of the family here and online to bring this all together. And so Simon will be talking about some of the work he's done about Jacob Bronowski's poetry, which is held here in the college archives. And I'd like to say a particular thanks to Rob Payne, without whom the archives would not be the state they are, and without whom this talk would probably not have happened, certainly not in this format. And it's a very timely period because there's a lot of things happening which are completely relevant to this. So partly the college archives are moving from where they were spread out around the college to a dedicated space here in West Court, the land that we've taken back, been given back by Wesley College. So not only the archives moving here, which is another link, but we've also opened, and we had John and Rachel and Simon here for the opening of 2 rooms in the new area, the Lisa Jardine room and the Jacob Bronowski room. So that part of the college is very much a tribute to this absolutely amazing family. I'm not going to say too much about the amazing things that Jacob has done because we're going to hear all about that in this lecture. And I'm not going to say too much either about the amazing things that Simon has done, though you should look out for the album he has coming out later this year. I'll let him talk about it if he wants to. But he is a professor at the University of Exeter working on Victorian poetry, interested in working class poetry, political engaged poetry, and much, much, much more. Simon, thank you so much for being here for this year's Lisa Jardine Lecture. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. I should begin, I suppose, by acknowledging that I think I am the first person to deliver one of the Lisa Jardine Memorial Lectures who never actually met Lisa. In my defence, the topic of this lecture, as Julian said, is the poetry of Jacob Bronowski, who was Lisa Jardine's father. And also, as he referred to, as a secondary line of defence, I can claim close links with the family. I want to say thank you to the Intellectual Forum generally for inviting me to the lecture and to the Jesus College Archives for providing the basis of its content. In fact, it was Rob who suggested this talk, I think. So Jacob Bronowski is a famous alumnus of the college, and of course Lisa, his daughter, the older child pictured here, was the college's first female fellow. They both excelled in their disciplines, and if you created a Venn diagram of their interests, they would overlap where history, science and art meet. I hope that this lecture not only helps to complete what we know of Jacob Bronowski, but also provides a little familial context, if you like, for Lisa's intellectual legacy as well. So the book, Jacob Bronowski Selected Poems, will be published in May, but is actually available for pre-order. Get the plug in there. As you can see, we've designed the cover already. We have that done. We tried to choose an image of Bronowski that was not widely known, and we believe that this photograph was taken in the late 1930s or early 1940s, which is when the bulk of the poetry, or rather the largest section of the poetry that is in this volume, was written. It was a very productive poetic period for Bronowski. The image came from Bronowski's daughter, Judith. Bronowski had 4 daughters, Lisa, Judith, Nicole, and Claire. I'm grateful to Bronowski's surviving family for their support of this project in all kinds of ways, and also to Stephen Fry for providing a wonderful foreword to the book, which managed to effortlessly complement my introduction before he'd even read it. In fact, he's still not read it. I didn't want to start the lecture with, sounding like I'd won an award, but at the same time, I didn't want to start the lecture without recognizing that this kind of project is always collaborative. There's a lot of people being involved in this. So this is an overview of the content and structure of this lecture. I'm going to give a brief biography, an account of how the book emerged as an idea, and a section on finding and editing the poems, which I will try to keep as brief as possible so as not to alienate those who might not share my bibliographic ardour. And then there will be a discussion of the poems themselves and what they represent in aesthetic, literary, and indeed political terms. The more I've read these poems, the more I've realised what's been missing from several narratives of literary history through the 20th century. This voice of Bronowski's, his poetic voice, is an important modernist voice that has not been really heard. And it's a poetic voice that would have been included in any account of British Jewish literature of the 20th century, had it been known. But it's also poetry that provides significant context for the understanding of the life and philosophy of a man whose work in various fields was central to the development of ideas of art and science in the 20th century. I'm going to finish the lecture with a brief reflection on how we might read this poetry today in contemporary world events. Although I'm sure by this point some of that relevance will have become apparent. Professor Brian Chayette notes in his cover endorsement for the book, that's not the best that Bronowski's poetry, and this is a quotation, speaks to the present moment with the force of prophecy. And this is difficult to deny. To my mind, though, there are 2 reasons for this. One is Bronowski's wisdom and his extraordinary ability to step back and view the human condition with clear eyes, informed by a deep engagement with an array of cultural, artistic, and scientific subjects. And the other reason is that, unfortunately, the world has just not changed that much. Reading poems from the 1930s, which feel contemporary, can only make us fear some equivalent repetition of the 1940s. But let's begin with that first section and ask the apparently straightforward question: who was Jacob Bronowski? And I know it's unfashionable these days, but perhaps we should consult the experts on this.
Perhaps it's from the zoo. Which zoo? How should I know which zoo? I'm not Dr. Bloody Bronowski. How does Dr. Bronowski know which zoo it came from? He knows everything. Oh, I wouldn't like that. It'd take the mystery out of life.
The experts. I have to give special thanks to Jacob Bronowski's great-grandson, Rafe Bately, aged 12, who was able to edit and embed this clip with a speed and efficiency that is way beyond my analog capabilities. And of course, Dr. Bloody Bronowski did not know everything, but there was a significant period of the second half of the 20th century when he seemed to represent the ultimate figure of the polymath. From his first appearances on the BBC's Brains Trust to his groundbreaking TV series, The Ascent of Man, Bronowski's voice, which retained that distinctive Eastern European inflection, was the epitome of a certain type of intellectual wisdom. And of course, the mystery of life, alluded to there by Graham Chapman, is exactly Bronowski's concern. And like all good scholars, every answer he found led to myriad questions. As a literature professor and sometime writer, I spend a significant amount of time collecting and presenting factual information. But I have to admit that compiling a brief biography of the introduction, for an introduction on the book of Jacob Bronowski, was one of the most difficult things that I've done. I can see several of you squinting at these facts. Are you not astonished? Just considering the man's achievements is vaguely exhausting. I don't have time to go into some of these elements with anywhere near the degree of attention they deserve. However, it is worth considering some of these in relation to each other. It should be noted that Bronowski could barely speak English when his family moved to London from Poland when he was 12, and that less than a decade later, he was editing a Cambridge literary journal which contained some of the most important British modernist voices of the late 20s and early 30s. You can see the list of writers on the list there. Certainly William Empson, T.H. White and Hugh Sykes were at Cambridge with Bronowski and involved in those literary endeavours. He also knew well Auden, Beckett, Graves, Joyce, the list goes on. His wife, Rita Koblenz, had been similarly precocious. She was a talented artist who won a scholarship to St Martin's School of Art, age 15. And continuing his diversity of achievements, Bronowski published a collection of poems on the subject of the Spanish Civil War and a monograph of literature criticism while teaching mathematics at the University of Hull. Within 3 years of being investigated for apparent communist sympathies by MI5, he was entrusted with high-level national security knowledge working for strategic operations during World War II. There's a generational element to this MI5 story. Bronowski's mother actually was a communist. She was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. I think his sister was as well. And his daughter, Lisa Jardine, many years later gave a fascinating lecture on the mistaken belief that her father had been a fellow traveller. Bronowski was not a communist. He was left-wing, broadly. He recognised economic injustice and capitalist greed, but his politics were relatively moderate. The image here is of Bronowski and Rita in Venice in 1952. And at the top there is the editorial board of Granta in 1930, including Bronowski, who you can see there, second from the right, and Michael Redgrave on the left there, and seated in the middle is Alistair Cook. Exactly, yes, who was at Jesus at the same time as Bronowski was. You'll have to buy the book if you want to read an account of Stephen Fry's conversation with Alistair Cook about Bronowski when they were students together here. It's in the years after World War II that Bronowski's name begins to be known more widely, and his achievements in various fields are recognised. During his work at the National Coal Board, he was responsible for developing Bronowski's briquettes, which were innovative but not commercially viable. and longer-lasting innovations were developed by him, including in smokeless fuel. It was shortly after this that he was asked to examine the Twang child skull, which had been discovered in South Africa in the 1920s. And he was asked to use geometrical and statistical analysis methods to determine whether the artifact was an example of Australopithecus, and therefore a direct human ancestor. This was a brief entry into the viciously contested world of paleoanthropology at the time, but he was proved correct in his interpretation that this was a pre-human specimen, and the experience proved invaluable 20 years later when he made the Ascent of Man. In this post-war period, Bronowski's media career starts to emerge, and he was becoming a familiar voice on BBC Radio as a philosopher of science and history. Publications like The Science of Human Values developed ideas in moral philosophy, and that theme of humanism, which has informed his scientific approach, came to increasingly define him, both in the public eye, but also in academia and fields of innovative research and theory. Eventually, Bronowski was asked to take up his final major role, which he remained in for 14 years, developing and leading research at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies near San Diego. Some of his final poems are scribbled on Salk Institute notepaper. In 1964, the Bronowski family, Jacob, Rita, and 3 daughters, moved to La Jolla. Lisa remained in Britain, where she was studying for her undergraduate degree. In the early 1970s, Bronowski was seconded from the Salk Institute to the BBC to create the ambitious TV series The Ascent of Man. He died between its first broadcasts in the UK and the US in the summer of 1974. The Ascent of Man, commissioned by David Attenborough, served as the third in a triumvirate of ambitious BBC programmes which began with 1969's Civilization, A Personal View, made by the historian Kenneth Clark, and continued with 1972's America, A Personal History of the United States, made by Bronowski's old Jesus associate, Alistair Cook. Bronowski's contribution was a landmark television event in several ways. It utilised an array of innovative televisual technology to explain its ideas, and it was filmed at locations around the world. But watching it now, it's remarkable how intellectually ambitious and how unpatronising it is. There's a moment in episode 4, for example, where Bronowski has this aside. He's talking about metals, he's talking about metallurgy, but he says that it's akin to a kind of vitalism. He doesn't explain what vitalism is. He trusts his audience to know, find out, or glean from context. And this approach allows him to discuss his ideas in a register which is at once popular and intellectually rewarding. Another way that the series was unusual was in relation to the book which accompanied it. And that's an image of the book there on the right. Not only was it a global bestseller, but its text was largely the script of the series, transcribed verbatim. And much of that script had been improvised by Bronowski around individual topics in relation to whichever element of human cultural and scientific evolution he was referring to. This was a remarkable feat, which has been much discussed and even contested to some extent. But I wish to show that the poetry Bronowski was writing for many years before the Ascent of Man, alongside his lecturing and prose writing, demonstrates a consistent philosophy from which he was drawing. He could speak in the moment to the camera in this way that produced an extraordinarily intimate presenting style, because he'd been developing these complex ideas about the human condition for decades. This was history, science, and philosophy considered poetically and performed with a poet's ear. This brings me to the idea for this book. So I grew up in a working class area of Manchester, a working class household, and like millions of others, we had a copy of The Ascent of Man on our bookshelf. We also had a giant Reader's Digest tome called, I think, The Last 2 Million Years, which has not aged anywhere near as well, either intellectually or ideologically, from what I remember. These books kick-started my lifelong amateur interest in anthropology and what might be termed deep history. In 2019, I met Rachel, and we started a relationship, daughter of Lisa, granddaughter of Jacob. He was never known as Jacob to those who knew him. He was always referred to as Bruno by the family. It was a nickname that he acquired at school. Rachel and I, when we first got together, were discussing Bruno's legacy, and I asked where I could read his poetry, beyond the half-dozen examples which were scattered across the internet. We realised that although potted biographies of Bronowski routinely referred to him as mathematician, broadcaster and poet, his poetry was almost completely unavailable. It turned out that less than half of the poetry he wrote had even been published, and that the volumes it appeared in were disparate, and the publication context differed widely. And you can see that here. These are some of the places where he was published. He obviously was on the board of Granta in 1930, but this is a later 1960s, I think, 1960s cover. And that's when he was published in Granta again. Just a few poems there. I think he published one poem in The Listener in the 1960s. He co-founded Experiment, which you can see 2 copies of there. This is the only, before this I suppose, this is the only collection, these 2 are the only collections of Bronowski's poetry that are together as standard collections, as you would call it. But this one only contains 3 or 4 poems, and this contains 4 poems. It was also published in Ambit. So the poems are disparate in their publication contexts. So this led back to Jesus College, Bronowski's alma mater, where his papers were held in the archives. In 2021, with the family's permission, I began to gather the poetry from transcripts and notes collected by Bronowski himself, and to attempt to put them in some kind of order. It's a little bit of a coincidence that at the time I was engaged in the work, Jesus College was rebuilding its archives from the old Wesleyan chapel and naming one room after Lisa Jardine and one room after Jacob Bronowski. At this time, in 2021, the research was what we in academia call a side hustle. I am a Victorianist by trade, and my main research is on working class 19th century verse, having originally trained as an upholsterer, having worked in factories for 20 years before I got an English degree. I had a peripheral interest in the novels and poetry of Bronowski's near contemporary, Anthony Burgess, and I do teach modernist poetry in one of my undergraduate modules, but this is relatively new territory for me. I did edit a collection of Victorian poetry while developing the Bronowski project, and that gave me some useful experience. But another motivation for producing this volume is to give access for modernist scholars to read, review, and critique the poetry. Working with the Bronowski papers to collect his poetry was both enabled and complicated by the author's bibliographic and literary habits. A huge advantage was that Bronowski was an assiduous note-taker who documented, often down to the actual day, when poems were not just composed, but revised, sometimes many years later. He actually kept a diary in which he noted the composition dates of all of his poetry. It was Rachel, actually, who discovered this in 2025, while I had my head in the actual poetry. It solved the mystery for me, because many of the dates on the typed copies had clearly been handwritten around the same time, presumably many years later. How could he be so precise with the dates of composition? Because of the diary. But I wasn't to have it easy. Bronowski also revised at a later date almost every single poem that he'd written, whether it had been published or not. As you can see from these images, certainly the first 3, this one, and this one, he's actually made handwritten revisions directly onto copies ripped from the original publications. This is quite unusual, not just in terms of poetic practice, but also in terms of literary legacy. There's an almost unacknowledged, but nevertheless recognised convention in the literary world that once a text is published, that's its final form. This is especially the case with poetry, which is often inflected with ideas of authenticity, truth, and what we might call the emotional moment. There are some famous cases where different versions of poems have appeared. In 1816, Percy Shelley gave the only copies of his famous, well, to become famous poems, Hymn to Intellectual Beauty and Mont Blanc, to Lord Byron to take back to Britain for publication. It's not Shelley's fault that Byron subsequently handed them over to the magnificently named but highly dodgy individual Scrope Davis, who promptly lost them. So the versions that Shelley recreated from memory became part of the canon. And it was 150 years before slightly different versions reappeared above a room in a bank in London in the 1960s. W.H. Auden, who Bronowski knew from his days as part of that British modernist scene in the 1930s, famously renounced some of his early poetry and rewrote it and republished some of it, including, most notoriously, his iconic musing on approaching war, September the 1st, 1939. After Auden's death, scholars and the reading public were united in their neglect of the revised versions and went back to the originals. As you can see from these images, Bronowski made sometimes very substantial edits to his poetry. The level of revision in the first three examples here is not untypical, and the outliers really are the actual handwritten fair copies, such as this one. But why would a writer revise almost all of his previous work so assiduously and make such detailed notes about every part of the process? The answer seems to be that Bronowski intended his work to be collected. At least in part, this wasn't just an eye to posterity, a la Shelley, but involved concrete plans to publish a selection of his work in a volume. At some point in the early 1940s, probably while still lecturing at Hull, Bronowski planned a collection entitled The Thumb in the Margin. The title refers to the long autobiographical poem composed in February and March of 1940, which would have closed the collection. I've no idea why this volume never appeared. Perhaps he didn't get round to it. He was a busy man, as we've seen. Perhaps his work for the government during the war interrupted his plans. He might have tried publishers but been rejected, but I can find no evidence of this. And he does retain a rejection note from a publisher from an individual poem in the 1970s. We can see here the note referring to the plans for the collection. I have here collected final versions of my printed poems because these cannot be withdrawn, and of my poems which I value. Helpfully, Bronowski lists all the poems he has written to this point, whether they make the cut or not. For the first three chapters of my publication of Bronowski's poems, I've retained the author's chronological grouping, and I've included all of the completed verse from these sections, as you can see here. These three chapters are effectively the collected works that Bronowski intended, beyond the narrower project of The Thumb in the Margin. It's worth noting that Bronowski continues rewriting his poetry in the post-war years. He revised some poems that had been sent out to hundreds of people on Christmas cards when he collected them for publication in magazines. As an editor, I believe that it's, as far as possible, it's a good idea to follow the literary intentions of the writer you are working with. Sometimes these intentions might go against your own instincts or the literary conventions of the day. But this work is not of today. And when a writer's legacy is in someone else's hands, I feel there's a responsibility to give the originator of the work as much posthumous agency as possible. Bronowski's early poetry was published in well-regarded but obscure modernist magazines and journals which are inaccessible to the wider public, having largely not been digitised or republished. I don't think it's a betrayal of any literary principle to trust the mature poet to curate and even correct the younger poet. To my eye, or even my ear, one might say, these corrections are almost always improving, with sharper rhythms and more incisive expression and imagery in the edited versions. Also, in linguistic terms, Although he was publishing alongside some of the most prominent names in British literary modernism, the early work can really be regarded as juvenilia. He'd only been speaking the language he was writing in for a few years. But that's enough retrospective justification and context. Let's now look at the poem. The first three sections, as I've already said, are Bronowski's own grouping, but the next two seem to define themselves. From 1939 to 1973, Bronowski and his wife Rita produced these Christmas card poems, which seemed to make a chapter in themselves. But then I also grouped miscellaneous poems, some of them which are personal, some of which are satires, from 1939 through to 1974. You'll see when I briefly got the idea of the topics of the poems there, that politics becomes more and more part of the poetry as we go through. This is a poem from 1931, from that first section. And on the right there is an image of the author as he looked when the poem was written. The poetry from the first 3 years of Bronowski's poetic career, as recorded anyway, are all in this high modernist style, as you might describe it. Much of it's imagistic, where there are high culture references, and quite naturally there are hints of T.S. Eliot in the decade after the publication of The Wasteland. But we can hear a distinctive syntactical shift of a particular modernist style. Spring, the recession of water, which turbulence sucked away under the land, returns. But now in flood, higher than any main. Now the blunt peninsula of Europe noses into trouble. Not only flood, but flows shoulder up, and the old glaciers like bears wade out of the water. Under, the rocks wait to be brunted again with the parallel strokes of ice and hibernation. We wait, until garlands shall be frozen from the breath, and the blood will sift into the moraines, until at last the stream's opening there shall drain into the artery of the spring, terrifying its turbulence, sucking away the land. Bronowski, despite the modernism to some extent, does tend towards structure, and you can see that the last two lines repeat three terms from the beginning: spring, sucked, and turbulence. Interestingly, this is the only poem from this section where there's even a vague reference to the politics which would characterize much of his subsequent work. In 1931, once Bronowski graduates, his poetic confidence begins to develop further, and so does a distinctive poetic voice which allows for elements of sly humour in his work, as well as its characteristic scientific and humanistic subject matter. Stephen Fry quotes from this poem in his foreword, noting its self-confident and self-mocking tone. Poet, and this is just part of the poem. Poet and geometer, I read with pride Socrates' praise of the two arts, and man, am arrogant that he's spoken proudly of men, but they wrong but in the mistaking of rightness. Poet and man, I read haughtily how Bruno held his truth highly, and Galileo made no peace but with Italian exact passion. Geometer, take joy that fashions segre our art of the faith of these. Note here the reference to Giordano Bruno, the 16th century poet, astronomer and philosopher, which allows him to insert his own nickname into the work. This period is also this period of 1937 to 1940 is the most productive of Bronowski's career. So I'll discuss a few of the poems from this. It's also where several elegies of famous figures appear, as well as more consistently political focus. This poem combines the two, and indeed it was published, this elegy to Gabriel Garcia Lorca was published in a pamphlet that contained 4 poems on the topic of the conflict. These are the first 10 lines of the poem. Step after step into the darkened landscape we mourners walk with you, until the guns speak. Speak to the muffled dead for the loss of the gypsy's glory and the matadors. Walking, did you see the cape and dancers flutter and fall still, the falling lances? The picador is Don Quixote. The gypsy begs, and the poet's mouth is bloody. blood reddens the windmill arms of Armageddon. Written more than a year after Lorca's death, this is much a consideration of the political context of his murder as a tribute to the man. This piece was unpublished, but it's an early illustration of Bronowski's expansive and inclusive perspective on human achievement. 30 years after this, the Ascent of Man would celebrate the conceptual and material development of humanity in such a way that sidesteps any great man theory, and that would recognise innovation as a collective narrative. Yes, the common man has fingers so fine that all the world is his design. Other ages ended when a king changed his fancy, but ours is beginning in the hands of boys, alive in the craftsman and the diver, beginning, at the building plot and the gear cutter. On the allotment it grows, it fountains, finer than Venice, the precision of mechanics. Finer than Venice, the precision of mechanics might be read as a liberal valorization of the figure of the manual worker, but it's more than this. It's an appreciation of the deep structure of the material world and how human understanding of it has emerged from labour, ritual, practice, and the fine balances between repetition and variation. In formal terms, the piece is composed in rhyming couplets until the last lines which break down the form, opening out into a more expansive perspective of human achievement. The title of this lecture, The Breath of Science, comes from this poem, which is also composed in couplets. This is an extract from the middle of it. Jostled the courts of Italy with light and gave the poet's words the painter sight. The word it was that touched the faggot Spain. The will to know sprang from the word in pain. This drove Linnaeus, this made Berkeley heard. The breath of science was the hungry word. It taught the poor aright, the right a need, the need rebellion, and the word was deed. Here, Bronowski takes a Shelleyan perspective on the power of language. The Romantic poets phrase the unacknowledged legislator, which came from the essay A Defence of Poetry, which is discussed in Bronowski's 1939 monograph, The Poet's Defence. But this piece, even in this extract of 8 lines, identifies verbal communication as the prime mover in all artistic, scientific, and political endeavour. The poem was composed July 29, 1939, just 2 months before the outbreak of the Second World War. That month happens to be, as far as we have evidence, the most productive period of Bronowski's writing career. But we can see here that the ideas behind some of the central theses of the Ascent of Man are already formed. Poetry, language, science, art, and politics were being considered not as separate subjects, but as constituent parts of the same human conversation. Characteristically, Bronowski spent some time in the late 60s cataloguing many of the Christmas cards he and Rita famously sent out to family and friends almost every year from 1939 until Bruno's death in 1974. The cards became something of a cultural phenomenon, and family stories tell of makeshift production lines taking up domestic space, creating these beautiful artifacts in the weeks leading up to the holiday period. Judith Bronowski produced a lovely book of the artwork and poems a few years ago, and here we can see that Bruno lists which poems have been published where, quite assiduously, and their exact dates of composition. In the mid-60s, he collects 10 of them for publication together in Ambit magazine. But even then, he cannot resist making revisions to them, despite the fact that these poems, along with Rita's beautiful lino print illustrations, had relatively recently graced the mantelpieces of hundreds of friends and acquaintances. Particularly in the later Christmas cards, the poems become increasingly political. And here there is a seasonal echo of the kind of Victorian newspaper poetry that I'm used to analysing. I collected hundreds of poems on the topic of the Lancashire cotton famine in the 1860s from local newspapers, and every Christmas there is a spike in these types of texts. In Lancashire in the 1860s, the effects of poverty were exacerbated by the winter cold, not a problem in Bronowski's Southern California setting. In both cases, though, this is about end-of-year reflection. And Bronowski's willingness to address political issues alongside seasonal greetings is significant, even if it proportionately reflects the incidence of political themes in his poetry more generally. The Christmas cards, poetically and graphically, are a major achievement by the Bronowskis and deserve much more attention than I can give them here. I'm going to look at two that were created nearly 30 years apart and just read them, merely note how little appears to have changed in the general tenor of the geopolitical landscape that Bronowski chooses to view. It was no star the Magi heard, but the stutter of a bird that in falling struck a spark from the milling veins of dark. They did not guess what engines would splatter all his breast with blood, nor how shameful we should think the white feathers of his wing. Yet that ghost or bird shall climb iron sky and hooded time, till the drumming engines spill, every bird but this be still. And then from 1968, nearly 30 years later, beyond the walls of dogma bloom, you must believe me, fields of broom. The birds shout and the beaches shiver, light in the sky under the river. And clouds of lilac sigh to reach lovers laughing as they touch. Our blessings on the heads of state who lead us, oh, not there, but straight. Who weigh the gravity of laws, pot against a bombing pause. Measure the parallels, assess whether Prague is worth a mass, and in the dusk of overkill pontificate about a pill. While still the walls of dogma nose towards the stations of the cross. This is the latest dated poem in the Bronowski papers, composed March 4th, 1974, 3 months before the author's death. It's light in its style, but it's a political satire referencing Richard Nixon and the Watergate affair, which in more innocent times counted as a major political scandal and constitutional crisis. We thank thee, Lord, that heads of state are born first to be good, then great. Thou hast preserved the innocence of 37 presidents. Brushed by thy burning fingertips, truth is a trumpet on their lips. Father, I cannot tell a lie, said one. 200 years went by, and one, when earth's foundations shook, cried, praise the Lord, I am not a crook. The comparison between Presidents 1 and 37 is obviously pointed, but perhaps not as pointed as the comparison between numbers 37 and 47 that strikes the modern reader. We might also note the references to two deeply political romantic poets in the third couplet, which acts as a kind of pivot for the verse. Brushed by thy burning fingertips is almost certainly a Blake allusion, and it was Shelley who referred in the Ode to the West Wind, to the trumpet of prophecy. As I suggested earlier, I think it will already be clear by now the extent to which Bronowski's poetry speaks to today's political climate in terms of military conflict, populist demagoguery, and creeping fascism. This is a lecture slide from the final year undergraduate module that I teach at Exeter, which is called Poetry and Politics. I first developed the module in 2016, thinking that that newfound shift from consensus politics in that year would be an unwelcome blip. I've only really added the COVID and Ukraine images. These are just decade-long trends or cycles, but the ones Bronowski identified in his political poetry are now approaching the century mark. Bronowski's poetry contains great beauty and insight and musicality, but his political observations are still relevant because the world has changed so little. I don't want to suggest that Bronowski's poetry is without hope, because that's not the case. Our Age is Beginning and many other poems celebrate human achievement and potential with a distinctive warmth and optimism. But it's the poet's responsibility to see all. And I will leave the last words to Bronowski himself in an unpublished piece from 1937, which is both of its time and beyond its time in the way it dissects the allure of political conditioning, coercion, and dominance. I showed it to my students yesterday in the final seminar of that module, and we discussed its identification of the links between image and action, and between the media and the military. The gangster. The gangster with the sawed-off gun straddles the sea. There, under glass, film fan and man of war lies still. His emblematic armour has overwhelmed them, his visored face. The plume of smoke nods in his hands like welcome, death to those whom it delights. The dark dazzles them with pleasure whom the gunplay thrills. But through the screen his hand has picked the triggermen from them and set them drumming in bombers over Spain. The Moor and the stormtrooper are his legion. The Jew and Georgian obey him. And sick, the Pope who cries against them Antichrist. Their words glow in the bivouacs, and the children see them touched off the beaconed hills. It's war. Who will not clap his hands when these fanatics and the strong-arm men burst their right rockets on the 0 hour? Who will gainsay them, who has sat at dark, thrilled to see the mole nestle a gun in furs? The spool spins in a maze of silk smoothly. And then the newsreel of the shell-struck church and broken tree hums. And the gangster straddles the screen. There, under gas, film fan, man of war, and a world adore him. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for such a brilliant and powerful exploration. So much that I think people don't talk about when they just talk about the Ascent of Man. And as you say, so it feels painfully relevant now as well. So we do have time for some questions, whether you are here in the audience. If you're online, please use the Q&A feature and I'll try to bring them in. And it's been great to see some familiar names online. Who would like to start us off? There's a question over here, if we just get one of the microphones, yeah?
Thanks. You said earlier that you began the anthology by laying out the poems in the order that Bronowski had said them. Mm. Where did you go in your choice of direction after that?
By the dates. Every single poem is dated. I couldn't find a single poem that where either I couldn't find the date because it was written on it, or that there was contextual information that gave us. And very, very occasionally it will say spring 1939. But the vast majority of them are dated to the day.
There's a question from online. You talked about Bronowski being Jewish and humanist. How much did his faith matter to him?
It doesn't come through the poetry too much. He barely mentions, I think he mentions the word Jew more in reference to like this last poem than of himself. He makes one reference to himself as Jewish, but he doesn't seem to speak about his faith in the poetry.
Any from in the room? So what's the plan with the book? It's a question from me.
The book comes out in May. I was hoping that the book might come out by now. I might have a stall underneath the screen, but that's clearly not happened. But the book comes out in May, and which is a good time for me because it's after the end of term, and hopefully I can do some publicity for it and some talks. There are some talks of festivals and things that I may speak at, but they're not concrete yet. And Stephen Fry would have been here if he'd not been in Spain.
So always nice to know he has a good excuse for. So he's certainly welcome to come, and it would be lovely to know when the book is available in all good bookshops, presumably.
Yes.
So. Anyone if we go right at the back. Sorry, there's one right at the back, and then we'll come further forward.
Thank you. I was actually intrigued tonight by his work with UNESCO, and I just wanted to know if you explored any of that work, and maybe how he feels about, or would feel about, the kind of disintegration or
the destruction of sites.
Yes.
I think he would be horrified. I mean, it's a dangerous game, isn't it? It's second guessing retrospectively what a figure would think of today. But certainly his concern, and I think it also comes after that engagement with UNESCO comes after his witnessing of the devastation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think that informs his... and it's interesting that those things are not referred to too much in the poetry, and even in the post-war poetry, there is a kind of... Maybe there is a silence there, but maybe there is a silence in culture. And I don't think we should condemn that silence, but note it. But certainly, I mean, you only have to watch the Ascent of Man to get the sense of how much Bronowski sees not just the building. I think he sees not just the building, but the building of the building, how the building was built. And he seems to see behind things in a way that is quite unique, I think, and certainly unique in the ability that he has to present that.
There's a question up over here.
Thank you so much for this lecture. These are brilliant poems.
Can you imagine how I felt when I...
Yes. I want to ask you a couple of things. One is whether you know anything about the process of their composition. That's to say, are they mostly fair copies, or have you got any worksheets that show you how he made them? And also, can we go back to the one about mechanism? I'm sorry, I forget the title of it. It has a picture of that one. Yes, which is so brilliant. I just want to look at it again. It's full of repetition and strange rhymes, and seems to be about kind of design and the making of verse too. So do you think that some of these poems are kind of reflexive on their own process?
Absolutely, and as we've seen, reflexive of the author as well. And there is a kind of, there's often a kind of circularity, and there's a voice that is there through all of the poems, certainly from the mid part of that 28 to 31. The early ones are a little bit, you know, they may possibly kind of train too hard. But from that point onwards, that voice is there all the way through, that same voice. And I agree, there is this kind of, this reflexive kind of element to the poems. And Bronowski's poetry that's what I like about the fact that I've collected this, is because it all seems like it's by the same person. And that there's this kind of integrity to it.
Can I bring in a question from Nicole Platt online? I'm interested in your various references to working class roots. Could you say something about Bruno's class identification?
Well, the school that Bruno went to in London was a school for the sons and daughters of tradespeople. The sons, sorry, Rachel's correcting me. It was not co-ed. Of working people, and he grew up in London area. He grew up in a working class area. So getting and it was a scholarship that he got to Cambridge. It was on his own mathematical merit. So he came from relatively humble beginnings. His family were tradespeople. They were, you know, at most kind of lower middle class, as it were, educated, but not certainly not well connected, and certainly not wealthy in any way.
And does any of that come through in the poetry?
I think it comes through in the poetry in the sense that there's a celebration of all stages and all elements of human endeavour, and I think that resistance to that great man theory, that idea of individual genius, and of all people, to resist the idea of individual genius, Bronowski maybe there's a paradox there, but I do think he does that. I think he's. It's interesting that when he's referenced, and even when he's doing the elegies, One of the elegies is quite nasty, actually. It's the Pope who supported the Nazis, so that's worth reading. But not supported exactly, but looked away, shall we say. But there isn't this kind of valorization of individual figures, and there's a recognition of hierarchy and of the economic truth behind. I can see why somebody might have sat in a poetry recital that Bronowski was giving in Hull in the early 40s and might have misread his work as subversive, but it wasn't really. When you look at his politics, it's quite moderate, but he does recognise the economic realities, and he does recognise economic inequality, and I think that comes from his background.
So there's a question in the middle there.
A very little one, but I was unsure. He came from, you said Eastern European, but was that Poland? Or,
yes.
Yeah. So did he ever go back to using his Polish or writing in Polish, or was there any things that you discovered that he hadn't written in English?
Well, not in the poetry.
No.
Or it would be a different
so you never
editor.
went back
it
to
would
that
be a
at
different
all?
editor working on that. my Polish is rusty. I don't think so. I could be wrong. I mean, obviously he still spoke Polish.
There's a question at the front, and then I see a couple at the back, which we'll come to, but yes.
Could you say something about Bronowski's visit to Mallorca to live with Robert Graves in an arts colony?
Yes. So Bronowski and his then girlfriend go to visit the Robert Graves and Laura Riding in Mallorca, on the rocky side of Mallorca, not the beaches side of Mallorca, well, basically they're both kind of employed by that older couple. His girlfriend, Elise Roberts, I think her name is, she helps Robert Graves with the historical element of I, Claudius, which he's developing at the time. And Bronowski collaborates with on a dictionary, a kind of intellectual dictionary with Laura Riding, but they fall out a little bit. And there's a poem by Robert Graves several years later, which is satirical and not pleasant, which is mentioned in the introduction.
A couple of questions at the back, and I might try and bring one or two in from online. Yes, there's one there, and then...
Thank you. So you mentioned that he edited his poems continuously. Which version are you publishing now?
Say that again, sorry.
Which version are you publishing? The edited or the original?
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't believe I didn't make that clear. I'm publishing his versions, which to me is the versions that every single revision that he has made, I am publishing. So yeah, at some point maybe there'll be a scholarly edition that has both versions, one on either page. But this is what I mean by I think that I trust his revisions, and he does improve the poetry. There is, I didn't put it on here, maybe I should have done, but there's one long poem that he writes, very long poem, with like 10-line stanzas in it, and there are whole stanzas crossed out. I should say also that one of the reasons why the decisions that I made about which poems to publish in his uncollected element, which is from, it's not the Christmas, it's the miscellaneous ones from 39 to 74. I made the decision, and this seems strange, but I made the decision based on how carefully he wrote them. I'm a poet myself, or we used to be. So I know that if I've written a poem and I'm happy with it, I will write it in my neat handwriting. And that's a kind of handwritten fair copy before it gets typed up. So I read his handwriting, and I was obviously very familiar with his handwriting by then. I read his handwriting and made a determination on how serious a poem this was, or whether this was a note towards a poem. And he did have a thing where he wrote in notes on Salk Institute newspaper, note paper. He did have these things that were notes towards poems. So I published what I thought was the version he wanted to publish.
Over there, yeah. If you could.
Thanks very much. The previous poem that was on the screen was absolutely stuff full of the vocabulary of film, of montage, and what you might think of or call film-mindedness, which is a term that's been used in association with Humphrey Jennings. I'm just wondering to what extent he maintained those relationships throughout his life, because there are montage effects in the early work of Hugh Sykes-Davis as well. You mentioned Hugh Sykes-Davis in Petrom, for example.
I haven't seen anything quite to this extent in the later poetry. The later, and that's partly because this is 1937. There's a flurry of poetry in 1939, and then it becomes quite episodic. And there are some elements of that, though, that shifting around of the poetic eye, and I mean the poetic eye rather than the lyrical voice, and ideas of montage, even in the very short, mostly very short Christmas cards. But the language of film here, and this is what I was speaking to the students about here, is that the point I made about 1937 is this is the time when most people in Europe and America will have seen a cinema screen, and they will have seen the news through a cinema screen at the same time as watching the glorification of violence in the James Cagney films, and the gangster being the hero, in a way that it probably isn't so much in novels, and what media does to morality in that sense.
I was just thinking, though, of the way in which experimental film is as much about discontinuity as continuity, and it's the experimentation with film form.
Yes. 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 And, you know, this, I mean, I wouldn't say that he was... He is a poet that is inspired by modernism and writes in a modernist form, but he does in that way that... And I don't want to compare him to Auden because there are similarities. He touches on some of the same subjects, obviously Spain, but he has a similar relationship, for me, he has a similar relationship to modernism that Auden does, which is that he recognises it, he uses it, but he still has the, what you could see by the shape of the poems on the page, that he still has this strict idea of form and rhythm.
I'll bring in a couple of questions from online. The first is from Mary Becker. What was it like working on a project you have such a personal connection to the writer and his family? Did it make it easier or more difficult?
It made it easier. And I think it made it easier that I had, in a sense, a choice of proximity and distance in different ways. And that goes also in terms of my kind of my poetic expertise, such as it is. So I think this would have been a little bit more, maybe more difficult if I'd have been come to it as somebody who'd been writing about modernism for many years. But I think that knowing the family and discussing the Bruno and his life, and knowing that having something of a knowledge of the man through his family helped to make me, to enable me to make the decisions that I made in terms of which poems to choose, how to present the poems, and gave me this great energy as well to do the work, which you do need.
A question from Jazz. Do we know why the Bronowski family moved to Britain?
It's slightly conjectural, but I think it's partly at least to do with anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, like so many families. My own one element of my own family came to Britain earlier in the 90s. Well, probably around the same time actually, from Eastern Europe, from Romania and Lithuania, probably for similar reasons. And economic. I mean, sometimes it's not one reason, is it? But they did have trade links with London already, so they were familiar with London.
Okay. Any questions from here? Yes. A very regular attendee at these lectures. For John.
Sorry, I should just declare an interest of being part of the family, but not having discussed this project at all really with Simon. He's been so busy. Well, first of all, thank you, because it was one of the best structured lectures on something that I was very interested to hear about. It was beautifully delivered as well, so thank you. But what suddenly popped into my head just as you were going through it is that in my encounters had only been with the Christmas cards, because the family talked about the Christmas cards and you could find them and so on. And as you mentioned, Judith had put a small book together. And I never really looked into any of this earlier stuff. So, but the question in my mind now after hearing this is you've structured it with this period up to the Second World War in a particular way, and these very powerful poems are from that time. And what we now know, obviously, was that it is a sort of pivot in his life, the Second World War. First of all, not being able, he was too small, too short-sighted, couldn't be a soldier, but he had family in Eastern Europe, offering his services at various points, and then those get taken up, and that leads to the war work, and then in some sense triggers a lot of what happens afterwards, but particularly the sort of hinge point of having been involved with bombing, the effect of Nagasaki and Hiroshima had on him, and how he became a public voice at that point. So this is my question really, is he's up here at Jesus, he's in Granta, and he's got all these great, very erudite mates who he's with. And he's seriously functioning as a poet from what you're showing here. And a reasonable output, you know, it's reasonably frequent, and he's taking it very seriously. So my question is, do you get the feeling that up to that point he was thinking, well, I could be a mathematician and an academic teacher, or I could be a poet, you know, and he's still sort of trying to find his person, if you like, at that point. And then the post-war stuff is slightly different, and it feels a lot more as if it was almost a relaxation, a way of reconnecting with his earlier life somehow. And so it was just a question as to whether or not you felt there was a difference between the professional poet struggling and then a person who could do poetry but enjoyed doing it as the second part.
I think that's a good analysis of the difference, and the space between the poems also suggests that. If what we take from the archives and what we have is what he actually produced through his lifetime, there are much bigger gaps. There's a gap. He doesn't write poetry at all. It doesn't seem in 1941, 1942, 1943, and then it comes back again. But it comes back more sporadically. And certainly in the very late poems, there's a lightness to the poetry, and almost a kind of, some of them are quite, in a sense, throwaway. It's still Bronowski's voice, and you still get that wisdom that comes through. But there is a lightness to it, and perhaps that does indicate that there is a kind of a joy in creating poetry. But I think there are different joys in creating poetry. There's you can create a tune that somebody sings along to, or you can create a piece of classical music, and there are different elements of the way that you enjoy the act of creation. There is we can speculate about why he didn't publish, and it's at that point that he, in a sense, collects all his work but doesn't publish it. And the question then is why, and there are all kinds of possible answers to that.
I think that might be all we have time for this evening. There's clearly a lot more we could talk about, some of which will have to be in the book. So you'll have to, make sure that that's available. But Simon, thank you very, very much for a fantastic talk, a fantastic tribute to Bruno, and also a fantastic tribute to Lisa and the family. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And I'm afraid if you're online, that's it. If you're here in the room, there are drinks available for further conversation through round the back. So thank you for being with us. And again, thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you.